We rarely consider the architecture of certainty. We move through our lives assuming gravity will hold, that the water will flow, and that the financial instruments we rely upon, the currency, the bonds, the promises of value, are anchored to something immutable. This assumption of permanence is perhaps the most profound vulnerability of any advanced society. Stability, when prolonged, breeds invisibility, and what is invisible is rarely questioned. For generations, the global economy operated under the spell of such an invisible anchor. It was a system built not just on metal and ledgers, but on the profound, almost religious conviction that every transaction, every national debt, and every currency note was ultimately redeemable for a fixed, tangible truth. This was the operational framework of an entire civilization, a bedrock that supported empires, funded industrial revolutions, and coordinated the flow of capital from London to Buenos Aires and from New York to Shanghai. It was the great global synchronization machine of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Imagine a world where the value of the pound sterling, the French franc, and the American dollar were not subject to the whims of political maneuvering or speculative panic. Their worth was defined by a precise weight of gold, a mechanism so simple in principle, yet so complex in its global implementation that it fostered an era of unprecedented international trust. Governments, bankers, and ordinary citizens alike internalized this structure. They believed in the system because it had worked. For nearly 50 years leading up to 1914, this mechanism of convertibility provided a predictability that allowed the world to engage in levels of trade and investment previously unimaginable. It was the ultimate promise of financial discipline, ensuring that nations could not simply print their way out of trouble without facing immediate punishing consequences. This belief system, this complex web of institutional habits, treaties, and physical reserves, was more than just an economic policy. It was a cultural phenomenon. It represented the triumph of order over chaos, of measurement over speculation. The financiers of the era viewed it as an almost natural law, a force akin to physics, ensuring that the global economy self-corrected. If a nation spent too much, gold would flow out, tightening credit and forcing restraint. If a nation was frugal, gold would flow in, expanding credit and stimulating growth. It was a self-regulating, seemingly infallible mechanism designed to prevent the very crises we now take for granted. This absolute faith in a mechanical, self-correcting global framework is the central subject of our investigation today. We are looking at the moment when the world realized that the anchor they trusted was in fact tethered to nothing but collective habit. The system was so deeply ingrained that when the first tremors appeared, they were dismissed as minor anomalies, temporary aberrations in an otherwise perfect design. The sheer scale of the confidence placed in this structure made any serious critique sound like the ranting of an eccentric. To question the foundation was to question the very structure of modernity itself. If you find yourself drawn to the deep historical narratives that shape our present understanding of finance and power, consider subscribing to Timeline Unearthed. We delve into the failures and triumphs that history often forgets, but which continue to dictate the terms of our modern world. How did this magnificent, complex edifice of trust become so brittle? What were the hidden stresses accumulating beneath the surface of global prosperity? And when the inevitable breakdown arrived, shattering the illusion of permanence, what exactly was exposed? The answer lies not just in economics, but in the peculiar human tendency to confuse prolonged stability with eternal security. The mechanism at the heart of this global confidence was deceptively simple: the gold standard. In its purest form, established across major industrial powers by the 1870s, it meant that a nation's currency was fixed at a specific rate to a defined weight of gold. The US dollar, the British pound, the German mark, Each was a promise guaranteed by the government that it could be exchanged for a specific quantity of physical bullion. This convertibility was the engine of trust. Because every major currency was pegged to gold, they were also inherently pegged to each other. This created a fixed exchange rate system, eliminating the volatility that plagues modern currency markets. If, for example, the British pound was overvalued because the Bank of England printed too much currency, people would exchange those pounds for gold. The gold reserves would fall, forcing the bank to raise interest rates to attract gold back and discourage lending. This contractionary policy automatically restored the currency's value. It was a rigorous automatic discipline that prevented inflation and enforced fiscal conservatism. The system was elegant, brutal, and crucially autonomous. It took the messy business of monetary policy out of the hands of politicians and put it into the hands of an impersonal metal. The gold standard did not rise purely by decree. It was forged by practical necessity and imperial power. Britain, the dominant economic force of the 19th century, formally adopted the gold standard in 1821, solidifying its position as the global financial center. As Britain's empire expanded and its trade routes dominated, other nations found it economically expedient to link their own currencies to the system, essentially linking themselves to the stability of the pound and the perceived reliability of the Bank of England. By the turn of the century, the system had achieved a quasi-imperial reach. The era between 1870 and 1914 is often referred to as the Belle Époque, a period characterized by high capital mobility, low transaction costs, and stable prices. This stability was the system's greatest achievement and its eventual undoing. It fostered the belief that this structure was not merely a choice, but the natural order of global finance. The system's success was self-reinforcing. The more people trusted it, the more stable it became, leading to even deeper trust. While the public saw the gold bar as the anchor, the true mechanism of power lay in the intricate dance of international cooperation, or rather, the implicit dominance of one player. The system was only truly automatic in theory. In practice, it was managed by the Bank of England, acting as the global central bank, even without the formal title. When a crisis threatened, the Bank of England would often intervene, adjusting interest rates or offering emergency credit to maintain convertibility for its partners. This discretion, this subtle management, masked the system's inherent rigidity. The gold standard demanded total commitment, especially during economic downturns. It required nations to accept deep recessions and high unemployment rather than abandon the gold parity. This painful discipline was politically tolerable only in times of relative peace and prosperity. The hidden cost of global stability was the internal suffering of individual nations, a cost often borne disproportionately by the working class. This required a political consensus, a consensus that was shattered by the cataclysm of 1914. The First World War was the first existential stress test the system faced. When the conflict erupted in August 1914, European nations immediately suspended gold convertibility. They had to. The sheer cost of total war required massive deficit spending, financed by printing money, which was strictly forbidden under the gold standard rules. The war exposed the system for what it was, a fair weather mechanism, useful only when it was convenient. When the war ended in 1918, the world was faced with a critical choice: return to the golden age of stability or accept the new reality of massive debt and structural imbalances. The collective memory of pre-war prosperity was so powerful that the major powers, especially Great Britain, in a desperate attempt to restore its former glory, vowed to return to the gold standard. But this was a restoration built on sand. They attempted to return to the pre-war parity, the exact same exchange rate, despite the massive inflation and debt accumulated during the conflict. This act of economic nostalgia was the system's first, fatal wound. The newly resurrected gold standard of the 1920s was a fundamentally different creature. It was no longer automatic, it was managed, fragile, and politically poisonous. Britain's decision to return to gold at an artificially high rate in 1925 immediately crippled its export industries, leading to chronic unemployment and social unrest. Meanwhile, the United States and France, having accumulated vast gold reserves during the war, were reluctant to play by the old rules, hoarding their bullion instead of letting it circulate freely to stabilize the system. The discipline the system demanded was now impossible to enforce. Nations were unwilling to accept the recessionary pain required to maintain the parity, and they were suspicious of their former allies. Trust, the system's true currency, had been eroded by 4 years of brutal conflict. The global financial architecture was now a house of cards, where the failure of any single major pillar could trigger a systemic collapse. We must ask ourselves, in our modern world, what deeply trusted, complex systems are currently operating under the same dangerous illusion of self-correction? The trigger came not from a central bank failure, but from the periphery of the financial world. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 was merely the initial tremor. The true systemic failure began in 1931. As the Great Depression deepened, international credit froze. Austria's largest bank, Creditanstalt, collapsed, triggering a panic across Europe. Creditors, desperate for safety, demanded payment in gold, draining the reserves of countries across the continent. The dominoes fell swiftly. Germany, unable to pay its debts and facing bank runs, implemented capital controls, effectively abandoning convertibility. The pressure then shifted to London. In the summer of 1931, billions of pounds were withdrawn from British banks. The Bank of England found itself in an impossible position: maintain the gold parity, which would require crippling interest rates and mass austerity, or abandon gold and risk global humiliation. On September 21, 1931, the inevitable occurred. Great Britain, the historical anchor of the system, suspended the gold standard. It was a stunning capitulation, a moment when the economic world order, which had seemed so permanent, dissolved overnight. The system everyone trusted had failed, not because of a technical flaw, but because the political and social prerequisites for its painful discipline had vanished. The immediate consequences were chaotic. Currencies that had been fixed for decades suddenly floated, plummeting in value. For nations still clinging desperately to gold, like the United States and France, the pressure intensified dramatically. Their exports became prohibitively expensive, and their reserves continued to drain. The collapse accelerated the Great Depression into a global catastrophe. Nations responded by engaging in competitive devaluation, deliberately lowering the value of their currency to make their exports cheaper, and erecting massive trade barriers, a move known as a beggar-thy-neighbor policy. Global trade, which had been the engine of 19th-century prosperity, contracted sharply, exacerbating unemployment and despair worldwide. The failure of the gold standard was not just an economic event, it was a profound failure of international cooperation, leading to a decade defined by isolationism and economic warfare. The abandonment of the gold standard forced governments to recognize a new reality. The priority shifted from currency stability to internal economic management. Nations that abandoned gold early, such as Britain and the Scandinavian countries, immediately gained the freedom to lower interest rates and use monetary policy to stimulate their domestic economies. They recovered faster from the Depression than those who clung to the old system, like France and the US, which finally abandoned gold in 1933. This seismic shift marked the end of the era of automatic, mechanical finance and the beginning of the age of active government intervention. It necessitated the invention of new tools. Central banks gained unprecedented power to manage the money supply, and economic theory shifted dramatically, moving away from classical laissez-faire principles toward the Keynesian understanding that government spending was necessary to stabilize a deeply flawed market. The lessons of the gold standard's failure reverberate through every modern financial structure. The primary legacy is the understanding that no financial system is inherently self-correcting or eternal. They are all human constructs, dependent on trust and, critically, on the political will to enforce discipline. The modern system of floating fiat currencies and managed exchange rates, established at Bretton Woods and later evolving into the current framework, is an explicit rejection of the gold standard's rigidity. It prioritizes flexibility and domestic employment over absolute currency stability. We learned that forcing a complex global economy into a rigid, non-negotiable framework is a recipe for catastrophic failure when faced with massive, unpredictable shocks. This historical examination forces us to consider the current state of financial innovation. We see today similar waves of absolute faith in seemingly immutable digital or decentralized systems. How much of our current stability rests on technological mechanisms that, like the gold standard, have yet to face their truly existential political or economic stress test?